The Mi-24 attack helicopter, or rotary wing aircraft as they say in the trade. It has its own niche in aviation history, one of the best helicopters there is. In more than 40 years of operations, it's proved itself time and again. Despite its longevity, the Mi-24 is still soldiering on, in service, worldwide. Mi-24, Film 1, The Warrior. The Mi-24 became the first Soviet special mission attack helicopter. It was the brainchild of the great helicopter designer Mikhail Leontievich Mil. These days, everybody knows that the attack helicopter is an essential protagonist on the battlefield. The Mi-24's jobs include the fire support of ground troops, detecting and destroying enemy armor, and even attacking enemy helicopters. But in the early 60s, when Mikhail Mil first took his idea for such an aircraft to the military, they were not impressed, to put it mildly. I was there when it happened in 1963. There was a big event at Khodenka airfield. Mil mentioned that he could design a combat helicopter. Khrushchev and Malinovsky and other bigwigs were there. There was an aggressive disagreement between Malinovsky, who was Minister of Defense, and his deputy Grechko. Grechko was very keen on the idea, but Malinovsky wasn't. He said, "I'll crush this bloody machine with a stick," and worse. There was much cursing and swearing. Nikita Khrushchev just looked at them and then told them to shut up. Nikita Khrushchev was known for catching people on the hop. He decided to hold his Politburo meeting inside the newest IL-62 airliner. They were due to discuss the next 5-year plan for Soviet aviation. But nobody wanted to hear about combat helicopter development. What nobody seemed to care about was that Mikhail Mil's team already had plenty of experience of arming the Mi-1 and Mi-4 with rockets. Previously, the Mi-1 had been unarmed and the Mi-4 had carried just one gun. In cooperation with the military, Mil's team had been experimenting with helicopter armament since the late 1950s. At that time, the first anti-tank guided missile systems were being produced by the Soviet Union, and missile launchers were mounted on various support platforms. The Mi-1 became the first Soviet aircraft with an anti-tank missile system called Falanga. Despite positive results in the armed helicopter test programs, none of the armed versions went into production. The military preferred traditional support for ground forces, tanks and fixed-wing attack aircraft. So, the Mi-4 remained the only armed helicopter. And there was a military transport version with a heavy machine gun in a nacelle under the nose as well. But the leading Western helicopter companies were already carrying missiles. At the 1965 Paris Air Show, Mikhail Mil got a good look at the new foreign helicopters, particularly the Belle Iroquois, generally known as the Huey. It had gone into operational service with the US Army 4 years earlier. With its 2-pilot crew, it could carry 7 battle-equipped soldiers. But there was also a fire support version of the Huey that carried a mounted small-caliber automatic weapon, as well as rocket launchers on either side of the fuselage. Bell and the US Army were also thinking about fitting anti-tank missiles. At that Paris air show, the Soviet helicopters went down a storm. But Mikhail Mil's enthusiasm was rather more restrained. In his personal diary, he wrote, "For helicopters in general, we're 3 or 4 years ahead of the competition. But as far as military rotary wing is concerned, ours are well behind aircraft like the Iroquois." In that same year, 1965, Mil managed to resume work on the armed versions of the Mi-1 and Mi-4. At the same time, tests were finished on the Mi-8T armament system. That was a new helicopter to replace the Mi-4. It carried bombs as well as 57mm rocket pods on fuselage racks. Two years later, the K-4V system was developed for the Mi-4 helicopter. It included 4 Phalange guided anti-tank missiles and 96 rockets in 6 pods. Or, instead of the pods, you could hang various bombs or incendiary tanks or even pods carrying guns. As well as that, there were pivot-mounted machine guns in the windows and doors. And in this configuration, the Mi-4 couldn't do any transport tasks because the armament fully used up the payload capacity. So, it was used for fire support only. 185 helicopters eventually got the K-4V system. The armed forces used them to learn how those sorts of weapon systems could be used in combat, and also for basic crew training, of course. In the mid-60s, the United States intervened in the war between North and South Vietnam. The American Army famously made much use of helicopters. Rotary wing significantly increased the mobility of the US combat forces. It allowed them to respond more quickly and to concentrate force in the right place. It was during the Vietnam War that the Americans used an attack helicopter for the first time. This was the Huey Cobra, developed from the original Huey Iroquois. The Cobra specialized in fire support for landing troops. It carried rockets and guns. It was compact and very maneuverable. Clearly, Mikhail Mil was keeping up to date with global helicopter development. Indeed, by the early 60s, he was already designing new armed helicopters. Historically, the mobility of ground troops has progressively improved with technological development. At the end of the First World War, horses were replaced by mechanical horsepower, and the army became motorized. The infantry began to use armored personnel carriers. Mil believed that the next step in increasing mobility should be airborne personnel carriers, or combat helicopters. At first, he drew a rather small, single-engined helicopter. But it could transport not just the weapon, the pilot and the operator, but also a group of soldiers. It was also in the 60s that the development of infantry combat vehicles began. They had complete weapon systems, unlike the unarmed vehicles and lightly armed infantry carriers. On the range in Alabino in the Soviet Union, the tests of the new BMP-1 were in full swing. The designers and engineers of the Mil Bureau came to check out the new military vehicle. Some of the helicopter designers came away with the idea of creating an airborne infantry combat vehicle. This helicopter would transport the infantry to the battlefield and also provide their fire support. At the time, there was nothing in the world like this. They were either assault helicopters or combat helicopters. Mikhail Mil decided that what was needed was a helicopter like a ground infantry combat vehicle. He privately called it VBMP. He shared his thoughts with us about the project and what he was doing in it. And since the work on Mi-24 had already begun, the military had to be convinced that they actually needed this machine. They needed to see that it was not like any other combat helicopter. In 1967, Mil managed to persuade Andrei Grechka, the first Deputy Minister of Defense, to convene a conference on combat and assault helicopters. As we heard earlier, Grechka had always been sympathetic to the idea of armed helicopters. He supported Mikhail Mil during the discussion of those ideas. I would say that after that meeting, the concept of a new helicopter was born. The Design Bureau made a convincing presentation of the new concept. Mil dealt with all the major issues in some detail. Andrei Grechka was so impressed that he even asked the chief designer to leave at least some problems for the military specialists. The reactions of the military were very different. Some were extremely negative. One such was the head of the main political directorate of the Soviet Army, General Alexei Ipyshov. He actually said, "We have to put the chief designer in the helicopter and send him to war so he can find out what a nonsense he's offered." But Mikhail Mil knew what he was doing perfectly well. The concept of an armed helicopter wasn't anything new for Mil. He'd even developed the idea of armament for autogyros, the helicopter's predecessors. Before the war, he and his team had worked on the concept of fighting autogyros for the Red Army. There was one for artillery spotting and one for fighting. But the way things were at the time, it wasn't possible to build them. During the Second World War, Mikhail Mil had studied the controllability problems of the IL-2 fixed-wing attack aircraft. His studies became part of his candidate dissertation on the issues of fire support aircraft dynamics. This designer knew every aspect of attack aviation inside out. Mil always applied the utmost thoroughness to any problem he had to solve. In spite of the differing views for and against the combat helicopter, the Mil Design Bureau was contracted to prepare the technical design for just such a helicopter. The Kamov Design Bureau also got the same contract. At the Mil Bureau, they quickly came up with two new designs. The first was a 7-ton helicopter with a single advanced engine, and the second was half as big again, a 10.5-ton twin-engine helicopter. They built mock-ups. The Kamov Design Bureau had a cheaper solution. They decided to upgrade an armed version of their ship-based Ka-25 helicopter. That was already widely in use by the Navy. The Ukhtomsky helicopter plant had been involved for some time with developing armament systems for the Ka-25, including air-to-surface missiles. There was some support amongst the military for the Kamov offer. The final decision went in favor of the twin-engined Mil helicopter. The customer accepted Mil's preliminary design, but they wanted the GSH-23 gun replaced with a quick-firing heavy machine gun. They also wanted the main anti-tank weapon to be the Sturm system with a supersonic missile and a semi-automatic control system. The helicopter also got new aiming and navigation systems, and it was designated V-24. Conceptual design development began in May 1968. Mikhail Mil was busy with other projects, but he personally oversaw the development of the new machine. The organization of the whole project fell to his deputy Vyacheslav Kuznetsov. He was one of the most experienced helicopter designers in the Soviet Union, and he'd worked with Mil since before the war. In February 1969, the Governmental Commission approved the combat helicopter mock-up. The first prototype was designed in June. V-24 development went on apace, largely because of Mil's insistence that complex and critical components of the Mi-8 and Mi-14 helicopters should form the basis of the V-24 systems. Amongst those components were the engines, the rotor hub and swash plate, the tail rotor, and some of the transmission. A new TV3117 two-shaft turbine engine designed by Sergei Izotov was one of the best available. It compared well with foreign engines. In the summer of 1969, the Minister of the Aviation Industry, Petr Demyantyev, called a progress meeting for the new helicopter development. Mikhail Mil and some of his design bureau colleagues were present. The meeting was held in the minister's office. Only senior ministry people and a few of us from the companies were invited. Mil asked me to brief the meeting. I put up a poster diagram, that was all there was for briefings, and started. As I spoke, I was watching the minister, Petr Demyantyev. He was gradually turning purple with rage. After probably 10 minutes, he couldn't take any more. He blew up and he launched a tirade of abuse at me and Mikhail Mil. "What is this?" he shouted. It turned out that his frustration was because of the Sukhoi Design Bureau. They were developing a new system for their Su-24 aircraft called Puma. Our system looked pretty much the same. "So how many Pumas are you going to offer me?" he shouted. "Is it one more Puma or what?" The Puma electronic system had been developed for the Su-24 tactical bomber. It involved an awful lot of suppliers. It was a constant headache for the minister, Petr Demyantyev. Yes, and he said, "Stop playing the fool. There are all sorts of aircraft components available, so just get hold of them and make them work. There's the ASP-17 aircraft sight, a tank aiming device for the amphibious armored scout car for rocket guidance and a rangefinder. Let the designers from Krasnogorsk fiddle about with all those components. Get hold of them all, put them together, and that's it. And what about a turret design? Well, there's the Tu-16 plane. Why not take that turret and the KPS-53 sighting station? Just install all these things." So, eventually, that whole meeting led to a long series of problems, because instead of all the systems being harmonized, we ended up with disparate individual elements that were just not compatible. All the various suppliers went off in different directions. Nobody wanted to cooperate. There was no design leader for the aircraft systems as a whole. The factory test program began with tethered hops. Then on September the 19th, the new helicopter made its maiden flight. The test pilot was Yerman Alfierov. It had become traditional for Mikhail Mil always to watch the first flight, but he was not there for subsequent flights. The long strain had badly damaged his health. About 4 months after that first flight of the V-24, Mikhail Mil died. He was just 60. The development of the new helicopter was carried on by Mikhail Mil's colleagues. The bureau was now headed by the man who'd been deputy general designer, Marat Tishenko. The first 2 prototypes of the V-24 were built at the Moscow helicopter plant, and they were used for flight testing. After that, there were another 10 prototypes. 5 were built at the Moscow plant, the rest at the Progress Arsenyev aviation plant. Flight testing of the first prototypes began in June 1970 and took 18 months. The tests were intensive. They pretty much confirmed preliminary calculations. Problems were successfully solved. They mostly related to things like the strength of the fuselage, some unacceptable vibrations, and the helicopter's service life. That said, there were several issues that called for significant changes to the helicopter design. To improve the lateral stability at high speeds, they decided to give the wing an anhedral rather than having it straight. The Mi-24 had come into being much earlier than the armament system for which it was designed. That Sturm system and the quick-firing gun weren't ready yet. So the first prototypes of the combat helicopter had the K-4B armament system. As we've mentioned, that system had proved itself in the armed versions of Mi-4 and Mi-8 helicopters. They installed a single-barreled, manually controlled machine gun in the nose of the Mi-24 and Falanga anti-tank missile launchers on frames alongside the fuselage. But tests showed that the rockets would fly erratically and could even hit the fuselage. The frames were no good. Vertical pylons with guide rails for the anti-tank missiles were added on the wingtips instead. And that was how the helicopter got its distinctive silhouette. Next, the designers added unguided missiles, guns, grenade launchers, napalm tanks, and the rest. And of course, all of that needed to be tested. Another improvement during the tests was the further development of the engines, but the new versions had a lifetime of not much more than 2 hours. When missile launch tests and gun firing took place, the engineers had to be very careful with the engine handling. When the new engines were first installed, everything you could imagine went wrong. They were unresponsive, or they surged, or they had all sorts of other problems. The engine designers had more trouble than you could imagine. But eventually, the job did get done. As they developed the new sighting and gunnery system, the designers realized that the V-24 cockpit did not have room for the planned Raduga F system. That's what would have controlled the semi-automatic anti-tank missiles, and also the quick-firing machine gun. So the Design Bureau decided to enlarge the front cockpit in the 2 prototypes. And they also put in the new wing. So it was the end of 1970 before the first proper version of V-24 was developed. Production started at the Arsenyev aviation plant. Production aircraft all had the bigger cockpit and the anhedral wings. Also, the military had asked that the weapons system operator's position should have a full set of controls, so the operator could fly the helicopter if the pilot were injured. The production helicopter received the new designation Mi-24A. The next year, with manufacturer's flight tests complete, the modified aircraft was officially approved for Air Force trials. I personally got acquainted with the Mi-24 helicopter in 1972 at the Sborkina station at Brode Airfield. It was love at first sight. The Mi-24A may have been a bit homely with its square cockpit, but it was a real combat helicopter. And all the lieutenants on the squadron fell in love with this helicopter straight away, just because it was a combat helicopter. We liked the built-in armament system. The helicopter performance was great. Those old piston engines had gone and the new gas turbines produced enormous power. The Mi-24A helicopters were made at the Arsenyev plant for 5 years, about 250 of them in total. Once they were in service and on operations, there was plenty more development and updating, and their reliability and efficiency improved. Shortly after the Mi-24A went into mass production, the Mil Bureau began improving the armament system. A new, experimentally modified helicopter version was designated Mi-24B. It had a mobile turret with a quick-firing Yakushov-Borzova quadruple machine gun. It boasted an analog computer which automatically corrected the firing to compensate for flight conditions. Plus, it had the Falanga P anti-tank missile system with semi-automatic control. All of that increased the overall efficiency of the aircraft some 3 to 4 times. During gunfiring, the gyro-stabilized guidance gizmo allowed the helicopter to maneuver up to 60 degrees off its heading. That was a big improvement in the combat effectiveness of the helicopter. The Mi-24B prototype successfully passed the first stage of their flight tests. But then, all development stopped. It is because the military had found a problem with the Mi-24A. The view from its bigger cockpit was not good enough. Also, both pilots were in one cockpit. Not a good idea for an attack helicopter. They designed a completely new nose at the beginning of 1971. Pilot and weapon systems operator sat at different levels, in tandem. They each had a narrow, isolated and heavily protected cockpit with an armoured windscreen. And this arrangement solved other problems. The Raduga F system could achieve the wide angle of view necessary for its optical device. And there was room for command and control radio antenna. The military quite often complained that in some flight conditions, the Mi-24's directional control wasn't all that it might be. That problem was solved by moving the tail rotor from the right-hand side to the left and changing the direction of its rotation. And that apparently enabled it to exert more power, which fixed the control problem. As for the weaponry, as well as the rapid-fire machine guns, the Sturm supersonic guided anti-tank system was fitted. But the development of that caused some delay. In 1973, an intermediate version of the helicopter with the integrated Phalange system went into production, designated Mi-24D. In addition to the Arsenyev plant, the Rostov helicopter plant also became involved in mass production. The tests of the long-awaited anti-tank Sturm system with its supersonic missiles were complete by November 1975. At last, the helicopter now met the initial requirements of its customer. This was what the military wanted all along. The helicopter's development had actually taken nearly 8 years, and most of that time had been spent on the design and development of the sighting and armament systems. The new version was to be designated Mi-24V. Meanwhile, on the 29th of March 1976, a government statement recorded the official entry into service of the Mi-24D and Mi-24V. That made about 400 of the Mi-24 in different versions in service at that stage. The Mi-24 had quickly become popular with the military. In fact, combat army aviation had been born. New principles of its application had been created. The most important thing at that time was that the helicopter had successfully gone through its upgrades. We'd had no time to sit back while those developments were going on. A, then B, then P, and VP. And each version brought something new that forced us all to relearn and standardize. Different navigation systems, new armament systems, they all changed so quickly. And the result was that, having gone into service in army aviation in such numbers, the Mi-24 was simply the best. Aircrew didn't take long to master the new helicopters. Special training versions came into service so that crews could convert onto the type. But the technical training for new pilots was delivered on operational combat units or in special combat training centers. The Mi-24 had 3 different roles in the Soviet Army. As a combat helicopter, it had an anti-tank role, it provided fire support for the army, and it carried out tactical assault with pinpoint accuracy against personnel and strong points. In its transport role, it could land troops almost anywhere, resupply advanced forces, or more generally transport forces and their freight. As a medical evacuation helicopter, it would quickly transport wounded personnel. Mi-24V multi-role attack helicopter. Main rotor diameter 17.3 meters. Fuselage length 17.5 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 11,500 kilograms. Maximum loading capacity 2,400 kilograms. Power plant, 2 gas turbine engines with 2,225 horsepower each. Crew, 3 people. Maximum speed 320 kilometers per hour. Range 595 kilometers. Armament, Yak B 12.7mm quadruple machine gun. Rockets, OMS, Sturm anti-tank missile system. The helicopter was fast and maneuverable. In 1975, a female crew, pilot Galina Rastahuyeva and navigator Lyudmila Polyanskia, set several world speed and time-to-height records in one flight in the light version of the helicopter. Because of operational security, the record helicopter was designated A-10, and the pilots were photographed in the cockpit of an Mi-8. Also in 1975, test pilot Hurricane Karpetyan flew the helicopter to an absolute world speed record for helicopters of 368.4 kilometers per hour. That record was unsurpassed for more than 10 years. The helicopter design was technologically very well thought out. Its progress into mass production had gone more or less without a hitch. And airframes from the Rostov helicopter plant were the ones that went for export.
При разработке конструкции Mi-24
The Mi-24 was designed to be simple to assemble. Let me explain a bit. As one example, the tail boom of this aircraft, the bit behind the cabin, is joined to the tail pylon, where the tail rotor is, by a universal connector. So that tail boom can be made separately, with some preliminary installation bits inside. So the whole helicopter can be supplied in parts, in special containers, which actually don't look like a helicopter at all. You can take delivery of these big boxes by train, by air, any way you want. People wouldn't guess that inside these containers there's a combat helicopter. It's easy to assemble, either in series mass production in a factory, or it could even be after you've delivered the helicopter in its boxes right to the airfield. The Mi-24 had many design similarities to the Mi-8 and the amphibious Mi-14 helicopter. The engine and the rotor system were almost identical. It made for easy access maintenance, especially in the field. As with the Mi-8, you actually didn't need any ladders. The engine cowlings opened manually and turned into convenient servicing platforms, and even normally hard-to-access areas could be easily reached. Unlike the Mi-8, though, the Mi-24 had a wide tail boom, which ended in a large fin. At maximum speed, that fin created 2/3 of the side-to-side force that you need to balance the torque of the main rotor. And the wing on this helicopter helped to reduce the load on the main rotor, allowing that to maximize its life. And it wasn't only aerodynamics that improved the Mi-24's speed, but also the retractable undercarriage. In fact, it became the first Soviet helicopter with retractable gear. The Mi-24 fuel system consisted of 5 self-sealing tanks with a total capacity of 2,125 litres. If one of the tanks got damaged, the fuel system could still function. For ferry flights, you could put 2 additional metal tanks inside the cargo compartment. One of the unusual things about the Mi-24 is that the main rotor, and hence the engines, tilt 2.5 degrees to the right. And what that does is to significantly improve the accuracy of fixed weapons. The reason for this is that the helicopter often hovers with a slight bank, or it flies with a small amount of side slip. So, with this rotor and engine tilt, the roll and side slip of the helicopter are reduced to a minimum. Survivability is a vital attribute for a combat helicopter. So, the Mi-24's structural components, equipment and crew seats are all armor protected. Some major systems are duplicated. To protect against radiation and chemical contamination, the cockpit is pressurized with a slight overpressure, and the inlet air is purified and conditioned. The combination of the onboard flight and navigation systems and specialist electronic equipment provides flight stabilization, and that takes some load off the pilot and means that the helicopter can fly day and night missions in any weather. It can hover under automatic control. As well as the main navigation equipment, there was also a Doppler radar. Over featureless terrain, it would show the helicopter's location on a special display. But most of the time, pilots relied on their flying skills, a map, a pencil, and a ruler. By the end of the 70s, Soviet pilots were taking full advantage of the Mi-24's systems. New tactics for cooperation with ground forces were developed. As with all military service, the advantages and the disadvantages of the new helicopter became clear. The designers developed new ways to increase the helicopter's efficiency. During this time, the Mi-24 took part in every army exercise. These exercises proved the Mi-24 attack helicopter. It was a huge support for the army. That was, after all, its main role, and it did play that role so well. It was exactly what the army wanted and what it needed. The ground troops were happy that the Mi-24 was always there to help. But these were only exercises. Soon, the Mi-24 helicopter would prove itself in real combat. In the late 1970s, the Mi-24 became the main attack helicopter of the Soviet armed forces. New helicopters kept on coming. Mi-24 export versions were being delivered abroad, not just to Warsaw Pact countries, but also to the developing world. And actually, it was the export versions of the Mi-24 that had the first real trial in combat. That happened in 1977 during the Ethiopian-Somali War in the Ogaden. Since then, Mi-24s have been in armed conflict in many different parts of the world. And today, the helicopter still maintains its reputation as one of the most reliable and powerful combat helicopters in the world.
Вся группа на курс 120. На курс 120 вся группа. 300 до 500 разделите.
Mi-24, Film 2, the story continues. In the early 70s, the anti-tank guided missile system was developing rapidly. It quickly became a very powerful weapon. Combat helicopters with these missile systems posed a serious threat to tank units. Several accounts claim that for each downed helicopter, there were 17 destroyed tanks. It also started to become clear that only a helicopter could adequately fight another helicopter. Experimentally, they started carrying air-to-air missiles. During test flying, helicopters seemed to be the only aircraft that could fly low enough and use ground features to hide from their prey. So, training for Mi-24 pilots now included close aerial combat and very low flying. In the late 70s, an Army Aviation Center for combat training was established at Torshok. Pilots trained there in the new operational procedures for attack helicopter combat flying, especially at low altitudes. Combat tactics were developed as well as new ground-air cooperation schemes. After they completed the course, pilots could test their new skills back in their combat units. And in those regiments, the pilots were busy improving their skills. Some of these units were based in territories friendly to the Soviet Union. The biggest helicopter unit was actually in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The designers worked closely with the military to improve the Mi-24. Many different versions were designed. Some of them went on into mass production, others got no further than the prototype stage. In the second half of the 70s, more firepower was the cry. The answer? Fit the helicopter with cannon. The new version was designated Mi-24P. The Gryazov-Shapunova 30mm twin-barrel aircraft cannon was chosen, the same as in the Su-25 attack aircraft. But the cannon was so heavy and the recoil force so strong that it couldn't be fitted on a steerable mount. So it had to be fixed on the right side. But then the muzzle was alongside the weapons operator's cockpit. When the cannon was firing, the shock waves adversely affected not just the operator, but also the sighting system, and in fact, the whole aircraft trim. Mil Design Bureau engineers sought out the man who designed the gun, Vasily Gryazov. He approached the problem sympathetically. Okay, he said, I'll make it 1 meter longer, but no more than 1 meter. So the extended barrel GSH-30K cannon came about. But it wasn't enough. The muzzle was still alongside the fuselage. We decided to make extra inserts to extend the muzzle beyond the helicopter fuselage. And at the same time, because the barrels were now too long and the cannon could flex a bit, we had to design additional supports. Now, at last, the cannon was stable. All this development had taken almost 6 years, but the result was a very solid helicopter with a powerful and reliable weapon. The Mi-24P went into mass production in 1981. In the early 80s, the Soviet war against the Mujahideen in Afghanistan had started. Several Mi-24 versions took part. It became a tough test. They had to fight day and night in conditions of heat and high humidity. Once Soviet troops were openly involved in the war, it became obvious that many military operations on the ground were impossible without the support of combat helicopters. Soviet helicopter bases in Afghanistan were on the increase. It took some time for pilots to adapt to the harsh climate of the Afghanistan highlands. Most of the crews had no experience in mountain flying.
Вот здесь, конечно, не все было просто.
It wasn't simple, of course. Our squadron was based at Gazna, 2,200 meters above sea level. At those altitudes, when the helicopters were fully loaded with ammunition, they had to take off and land like fixed-wing aircraft, especially in summer, when the high temperatures meant that they were even more short of power. While the military pilots tried to adapt to these new conditions, the Flight Research Institute staff flew many tests to improve the flying techniques for the helicopters in mountainous areas. With the Mi-24 especially, they practiced takeoff and landing using only the front wheel. Sometimes combat pilots practice takeoffs off the front wheel. Our job as scientists meant that we had to decide the limits on such maneuvers, and we also had to issue recommendations to the combat pilots. We conducted our tests in Lenina Khan, now it's called Gyumri. It was near the Turkish border. The climate was pretty similar to Afghanistan. We needed hot weather, as you know. We'd load the helicopters with 2 or 3 tons extra to see how that would affect the takeoff. At first, even for me, it was bizarre to raise the tail of the helicopter first. I had this feeling that the rotor blades would hit the ground. See, the pilot's seat, the pilot is behind the weapons operator who's in the front cockpit, and you're looking at the ground through that upper blister. And when you're flying that maneuver, you push the cyclic stick well over the neutral position, right to the instrument panel. Then the tail of the helicopter lifts up, you add some power, and the helicopter starts to run. It runs 25 to 30 meters, and then suddenly you're off. During the tests, the engineers measured the running distance because they needed to know which was better, a short run or a long run. The Mi-24 became one of the symbols of the 1980s Afghan war. The helicopter's predatory silhouette was widely recognized by everyone involved in these operations. And it was in Afghanistan that cooperation between the Mi-24 and the Mi-8 helicopters came close to perfection. During the Afghan war, Soviet soldiers often compared our helicopters to angels coming down from heaven. The helicopters rescued the wounded, they helped the troops fight their way out when they were surrounded. When the Mi-8s were on their missions, the Mi-24s would cover them. So, when Mi-8s landed troops, the Mi-24s would be there to help, to give the troops fire cover. That's how the Mi-8 and the Mi-24 worked together. That's how they interacted. Their cooperation was honed and developed as combat missions progressed. Apart from the covering landing operations, the combat helicopters escorted convoys, they searched out enemy convoys, and they destroyed Mujahideen military bases. The tactics varied according to circumstances. To start with, the Mujahideen only had heavy machine guns and small arms. To avoid that, the helicopters flew at high altitude. But when portable heat-seeking missile systems appeared, it was safer to fly at very low level. Pilots had to maneuver hard to dodge the ground fire. Sometimes they pushed their helicopters way over the limits, but often that was their only chance. The Mil Design Bureau engineers often went to Afghanistan to learn from first-hand experience. It helped them solve problems quickly, to make their beloved Mil helicopters better. Combat operational experience helped us develop a major upgrade of the helicopter. We had to do it in some haste because the Afghan war wouldn't wait, you know. When we were sent there, the idea was to increase the helicopter's survivability and combat capabilities. So, our combat experience helped us make improvements. At the end of the war, the helicopters were much stronger, much better than they had been at the start. Combat survivability and combat effectiveness were significantly improved. The engines had to be protected from sand and dust with filters on the air intakes. Countermeasures against portable heat-seeking missile systems were developed. Amongst them, decoy heat flares with automatic dispensers, infrared jammers, and suppression systems for infrared in the turbine exhausts. Helicopters with the anti-missile systems were on station to protect transport aircraft as they landed and took off. We'd be tasked as the plane approached the airfield. We'd take off and loiter near the outer marker. When the transport plane got below 1,000 meters, we'd go to the inner marker. And then, when the plane was getting near the runway, we'd fly right next to it. In Kabul, our main object was the safe arrival of the planes, protecting their landings and takeoffs. We'd fly right next to them. We were really flying as a tight formation pair. I'd say we formed a sort of protection shield for the aircraft. As soon as it got to the inner marker area, we covered it from both sides. The same thing during takeoffs. We'd line up, then make a circle, and escort the plane until it was out of our zone. It was all a bit bizarre sometimes. The plane would land safely, but the helicopters would be badly damaged by enemy fire. The great combat survivability of the Mi-24 often helped pilots land safely despite heavy damage. We have a lot to thank the helicopter's designers for. They made crew protection a high priority. They made sure the most important elements of the cockpit and the fuselage were heavily armored. And that helped us psychologically because we knew we were protected from machine gun or rifle fire. Well, not 100% protected perhaps, but say 70 or 80% of the helicopter fuselage was protected. During combat missions, an attack helicopter would be the first to feel the effect of enemy fire. That's why they needed that extra protection. The designers tried armored glass inside the cockpits to shield pilots from sideways fire, but it so reduced the available space that it had to be dropped. Instead, the pilots wore a heavy armored helmet. They also had an assault rifle with ammunition and an emergency kit. The total weight of their personal gear was sometimes as much as 10 kilos. The intensity of combat missions was on the increase. Some pilots did several missions a day. During the Afghan war, most pilots and technicians were regularly rotated. Usually, helicopter pilots had tours of 1 year in Afghanistan. But some pilots stayed put for the whole war from beginning to end. And according to military figures, 50% of Soviet military helicopter pilots flew in the war. It wasn't just pilots that won the war. I reckon everyone who was sent there could be called a soldier. Even the technicians who stayed on the ground and didn't face the enemy. I consider them soldiers too. Besides all their work repairing battle damage, they also have to prepare the helicopters for flight. They'd carry belts of cartridges, they'd load missiles, and all the other vital stuff. It was all time-consuming effort. Yes, I would call them soldiers too, of course. Onboard technicians were considered crew members. They played an important role in combat missions. I would say they were the masters of the helicopters. They were in charge of the helicopter's condition. You're the person, all the in-flight failures will be your fault. And when the helicopter takes off, that's where your responsibility starts. You're responsible to the helicopter's crew, including yourself. Onboard technicians often became gunners. They fired the manually operated machine guns mounted in the windows of the cargo compartment. When we flew as cover for the Mi-8 missions, the onboard technicians had to operate the machine guns. That was very important, you see. But when the Mujahideen began using portable heat-seeking missiles, the Mi-24 crews began flying combat missions without the onboard technicians. High serviceability rates and the similar design of the Mi-8 and the Mi-24 made maintenance and repair easier. Most battle-damaged helicopters were brought back online by the ground technicians at the airfields. If a helicopter got damaged in combat, the technicians would repair it, and next morning it would be ready for its next mission. The technicians were magicians. They'd work day and night, so the helicopter was ready by 3 in the morning. Most of our combat missions started early in the morning, and normally we had to wake up at 3. We had great faith in the technicians. When we approached our helicopter before flight, we could see it was ready for a fight. It was ready to help us perform our combat mission. The helicopters were specially designed to be repaired in the field, sometimes even where they'd made an emergency landing. The helicopter's combat efficiency was improved by the arrival of S-8 rockets. Laser rangefinders, night vision goggles, night aiming systems, they all became part of the onboard equipment. With all these Afghan war improvements, the Mi-24 had become an incomparable combat helicopter. Much useful experience was gained in the severe climatic conditions, and that later helped make the helicopter even better.
Самым главным значением применения...
All that experience from the Afghan war helped us to build the next generation helicopter, the Mi-28. We updated and improved the Mi-24 constantly. We developed new equipment and armament. And later, that all came good on the Mi-28. It is true when they say war pushes technology forward. It was because of the Afghan war experience that the Mi-28 became such an extraordinary helicopter. But the price of this experience was very high. 127 Mi-24 helicopters were shot down during the Afghan war. In many cases, that meant the death of the crew. A year after Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan, a new organization called Army Aviation was incorporated in the USSR. It was a direct result of the war. The military had realized the importance of liaison between helicopter units and ground troops. Many Air Force helicopter units became part of Soviet Army Aviation. First Commander-in-Chief of Army Aviation was Afghan war hero Colonel General Vitaly Pavlov. Some of the pilots who fought in Afghanistan were involved in the recovery from the Chernobyl accident. Back in the 70s, an airborne chemical laboratory had been created based on the Mi-24. It had been intended for collecting samples from contaminated areas during nuclear war. The sampling instrumentation was in the cargo compartment. To get soil samples, there were special little excavators attached to the pylons. These special Mi-24 helicopters helped to make a map of the radioactive contamination around the Chernobyl plant. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. Like many other industries, the Russian aviation industry went into deep crisis. New helicopters to replace the existing attack helicopters were cancelled. Mass production came to a halt. There were some Mi-24 helicopters left in the former republics of the Soviet Union. Others were sold to third world countries where they provided exemplary service. But Russia was the biggest operator of the various different versions of the Mi-24. After the Cold War was over, the Russian aviation industry suddenly found it could demonstrate its aircraft worldwide. Aviation bureaus and companies flocked to international air shows. International agreements meant that missiles had to be destroyed, often in mid-air. Russian aircraft are great showstoppers, but what really gets people's attention is an aerobatic team. In the early 90s, the Russian Air Force Strigi, the Russian Knights and Flying Hussars broke onto the world stage. The helicopter pilots decided to organize their own aerobatic team. At the Torozhok Aviation Combat Training Center, the Berkuts team, the Golden Eagles, was established.
Знаете, все равно все пришло оттуда, из боевой подготовки.
It all stemmed from our combat training, you know. The team got going in 1992. By that time, we were all well aware of what our Mi-24s were capable of. We were experienced, we could fly both solo and group missions. We were comfortable with air combat. We each knew what the other could do with the helicopter. There was the odd difficulty, of course, but that didn't stop us. We had good support from above. The head of the center, Mr. Vorobyev, was very helpful, and the Army Aviation Chief, Commander Vitaly Pavlov, gave his approval too. But most of all, it was our desire to show that we could do it. The Berkuts helicopter team starred in lots of international air shows around the world. In 2012, they celebrated their 20th anniversary. Today, the team consists of two sections. One flies the latest Mi-28 helicopters, and the other flies the Mi-24 and its successor, the Mi-35. One of the exhibits at the Toroshok Center Museum is a unique Mi-24 helicopter. In 1992, an all-female crew, Commander Galina Rostohuyeve, navigator Lyudmila Polyanskia, and co-pilot Galina Koshkina flew it all the way from Moscow to Miami, a distance of 25,000 kilometers. The flight was timed to coincide with the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America and the 50th anniversary of the Second World War Lend-Lease program. They'd been preparing for the flight for nearly 2 years. There was lots of paperwork to do, including the complicated approvals for the route. And they also had to adapt the helicopter and indeed brush up on their flying skills. They did their training at the Toroshok Center, where the Army Aviation Chief Commander Vitaly Pavlov was in charge. The first person we went to see was Yevgeny Ignatov, the chief of the flight service. He didn't know how to cope with these two little women, and he was worried about our age. I was 56, and my colleague was 54. What shall I do with these pensioners, he thought. First of all, I was worried about their age, and it had been a long time since they flew the helicopter, but they really loved flying. They were very brave to take on this flight. I don't mean just the length of the route and all that stuff. It was just difficult to make such a big decision. Well, he was wary of us. But he assigned us to a remarkable instructor, Vyacheslav Tsimbalova, who had fought in Afghanistan. Vyacheslav worked with us, especially me, day and night, while I practiced my flying skills in the simulator. When I was ready, I got my clearance. Then Yevgeny Ignatova also tested us. On the first day of the tests, they'd planned 4 hours in the Mi-24 for me. But we were getting on very well with him, and when I'd finished the flying tests, it all became clear. After that first day, we were obviously going to make our flight to Miami. That training was just great. They were making very intensive preparations for this flight, of course, and they wanted to practice every possible situation that they might find themselves in on the flight. One day they called the chief commander and said, "We've practiced taking off with only one engine working and at normal takeoff weight. But on the flight, we've got 4 extra fuel tanks, so we need to put extra weight and do takeoffs at those weights." Pavlov said to me, "She won't let you alone, just let her fly with her 4 fuel tanks." So we started with empty tanks and then with full tanks. That was okay. Then Galina said, "They only let us land at the airfield here, but we're going to fly over Chukotka, so we need to practice landing on a landing site." Pavlov said, "Well, you know her. Let's train her on a landing site." These women had decided to make this extraordinary flight. They just loved flying and they trusted the helicopter. They started from Moscow on the 1st of September. It didn't all go perfectly, but eventually this unprecedented long-distance flight of an Mi-24 combat helicopter and its escorting Mi-17 was complete. They landed successfully at their final destination in Miami. In the second half of the 1990s, the Mi-24 embarked on a new lease of life. Russian defense companies were resuming work on projects that had been cancelled in the early 90s. New aircraft, new equipment, new armaments were being designed. The Mil Design Bureau offered updates for its helicopters, many of which were still in use all over the world. The Rostov helicopter plant came to the fore in these developments. We really believed in the Mi-24, and we were still the leading manufacturer for it. We hadn't sold off our equipment, we'd kept our documentation, and we hadn't lost our people. And that's why we're still the leading helicopter maker in Russia. We were doing modernization work on the Mi-24, and also repairs. The Mi-24 kept us alive. As I see it, the key factors in the Mi-24 success are low-cost maintenance, serviceability, and reliability. New helicopter developments led to more modifications to the Mi-24. The Mi-24 VP with the double-barrel GSH-23 trainable cannon was used to develop one such mod. Only 25 of them had been built in the Soviet Union. At the Rostov helicopter plant, several Mi-24 VP got the same rotor system as the Mi-28 combat helicopter. And that meant fiberglass blades, titanium main rotor hub, and X-shaped tail rotor. They also got new high-altitude engines, and to reduce the total weight, a fixed undercarriage replaced the retractable version. The wing was shortened. The revamped helicopter made its maiden flight in March 1999. Gennady Ananyov was the test pilot. The results of all these changes were better range and improved high temperature and high altitude performance. The weight of the helicopter had been reduced, and at the same time it was more maneuverable and better able to survive in combat. In 2004, the Russian Armed Forces ordered several of these updated Mi-24P combat helicopters from the Rostov helicopter plant. The new model included a laser rangefinder and a thermal imaging target seeker. That gave it a night fighting capability. From then on, the manufacturers offered different options for the Mi-24 at different prices. The customer could choose between different combinations of helicopter equipment. And as well as upgrading existing helicopters, the plant resumed mass production of new ones. Today, customers from Latin America, Asia, and Africa are all interested in helicopters from the Rostov plant. The plant's traditional main customer has been the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and previously of the Soviet Union. And the ministry is still the main customer. Now the Russian Air Force has another new version of the good old Mi-24. This one is a new generation helicopter, the Mi-35M. Multi-purpose attack helicopter Mi-35M. Main rotor diameter 17.2 meters. Fuselage length 17.5 meters. Maximum takeoff weight 11,500 kilograms. Maximum loading capacity 2,400 kilograms. Power plant, 2 gas turbine engines, 2,400 horsepower each. Crew, 3. Maximum speed, 310 kilometers an hour. Range, 435 kilometers. Armament, twin-barrel GSH 23L cannon. Rockets, suspension pods, anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. The fiberglass rotor with its titanium hub and a new aerodynamic profile, as well as the X-shaped tail rotor, all increase performance and also combat survivability. The new instrumentation system has LCD screens, and the helicopter is day and night capable. There's also a night vision goggle system. There's a completely new weapon aiming and computer system with gyro-stabilized electro-optics that include the laser rangefinder and thermal imager. The helicopter has a protection system against missiles. To cope with rough landings, the fixed landing gear has extra energy-absorbing capacity, and that protects the aircraft's structure against abnormal loads. The shorter wing is equipped with a built-in hoist for the heavier weapons, and that also makes maintenance easier. The armament system has commonality with other Russian combat helicopters. Beside cannon and rockets, and depending on its mission, the helicopter can carry anti-tank or anti-aircraft missiles on 16 hard points. All of these developments expand the helicopter's all-round capabilities. The Mi-35M is the true embodiment of a modern combat helicopter.
То есть мы на сегодня имеем достаточно
So today we have a reliable and very effective helicopter, able to conduct missions by day and by night. But that's not just about flying at night, which most helicopters can do. The Mi-35M finds the target, identifies it, aims and fires at it day or night. The armament system automatically chooses the type of weapon to suit the target. And another part of the system helps the pilot detect any approaching threats and find the best solution to deal with them. We've waited a long time for this helicopter, and finally it's here. We've got what we wanted: new engine, new rotor and flight systems, and a new armament system. And the good old airframe can still please the pilot. The multi-role Mi-35M is what the Russian Air Force has long wanted. It takes the best parts of its predecessors: reliability, easy maintenance, and high combat survivability. Both the new Mi-35M and the Mi-24, in various stages of modification, continue to serve the Russian Air Force. The city of Koranovsk, the 393rd Army Aviation Air Base. The base goes back to 1942, when combat pilots defended the southern borders of the Soviet Union with IL-2 attack aircraft. After the war, attack aircraft gradually started giving way to helicopters. Since the 1970s, the airbase has been mainly concerned with the Mi-24. The Mi-24s became operational in a helicopter regiment which was then based in the town of Brody in the Carpathians. Much useful experience has been gained since then. There are still a few Mi-24Ps in service at the base. They're used as combat and training helicopters. The good maneuverability of the Mi-24 helps pilots to master helicopter combat handling. We've been training student pilots for several years. These are in their 5th year from the Sisran High Military Aviation School. This year, 6 students have trained here, and I tell you, there's one who's mastered the Mi-24. He'll be able to master all other types of helicopters. Why? Because when you fly the Mi-24, you can feel its gravitas. It won't forgive you for mistakes like the Mi-28. You need accurate technique and care and concentration. When you master the Mi-24 with respect, but with a firm approach, understanding what you can and can't do, only then can you call yourself a real helicopter pilot, able to fly any other helicopter. The Mi-24 still commands respect amongst military pilots. Time and battles have proved the Mi-24 a great helicopter. It served in many wars, including the big one in Afghanistan. And I may say that when you start flying it, you don't worry about something going wrong or any abnormal behavior. I think any Army aviation pilot will tell you that the Mi-24 is the helicopter you trust. It's like your fellow soldier. This combat helicopter, I've been flying it more than 20 years, is a great friend of mine. I'm not exaggerating, it's a fantastic old friend. The Mi-24 has made an invaluable contribution in the development of Army aviation. The proof of that can be found in Afghanistan, in the North Caucasus, and in peace support missions in other countries. How do I value the Mi-24? I give it full marks, the highest accolade. The Mi-24's got lots of nicknames. People call it Stripey. The NATO classification reporting name is Hind. But most people call it the Crocodile. It's a good name for a formidable predator machine. Because crocodiles are some of the most ancient, ferocious, and merciless predators on Earth. The Mi-24 symbolizes the whole era of the Russian helicopter industry. It's more than 40 years since it made its maiden flight, and in that time, it's become one of the best combat helicopters in the world. It became an inspiration for many modern combat helicopters in Russia and elsewhere. The Mi-24 has played its part in more than 30 armed conflicts, and it still retains its great fighting capabilities. It's still operating in many countries around the world. The legend that is the amazing Mi-24 lives on.